For Lisa, at 70 years old, the silence of that roofless chapel was better than the cruel words of her own family. Exiled from her home by her own children and betrayed by those she loved most, she found refuge among stone walls that time had forgotten. Everyone said it was just a condemned ruin, but Lisa saw there a mirror of her own broken soul. While she and Tom, a man who also knew the weight of loss, raised each beam and planted each flower, something extraordinary began to bloom among the ancient stones. Lisa held on to bitterness for a long time, but discovered that stone walls cannot stand on bitter hearts. The sacred garden she created under the open sky left the entire town speechless. But what she released within herself changed everything forever. This is Lisa's journey. Proof that inner peace is the only construction no one can ever tear down. If you've ever been discarded by those who should have protected you, if you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, if you believe it's never too late to flourish, subscribe now. Because stories like Lisa's remind us that dreams don't age. Lisa Hartwell was 70 years old and had spent 50 years being exactly what everyone else needed her to be. A devoted wife to Michael, who passed 2 years ago after a long illness she nursed him through with unwavering dedication. A selfless mother to Robert and Sarah, raised while working full-time as an art teacher, always putting their needs before her own dreams of painting. A reliable daughter to her own mother until the end, caring for her through dementia, while her siblings lived convenient distances away. For 5 decades, Lisa had been the person everyone leaned on, the one who sacrificed endlessly without complaint. And now, standing in the overgrown courtyard of a roofless stone chapel that hadn't been used in 35 years, with a single suitcase containing everything she still owned in the world, Lisa finally understood something devastating. All that sacrifice had earned her exactly nothing from the people who'd benefited most. The chapel, St. Catherine's, built in 1882 and abandoned since the roof collapsed in a storm in 1990, had been her mother's property, a small parcel inherited from Lisa's grandmother, who'd been the chapel's caretaker decades ago. When her mother passed 5 years ago, the property had gone solely to Lisa, written specifically in the will to bypass Lisa's siblings who'd never helped care for their mother. The chapel itself was structurally sound, massive stone walls that had weathered over a century, but without a roof, it had been declared unusable and essentially worthless by everyone who looked at it. Lisa's siblings had joked about it being a pile of expensive rocks and encouraged her to abandon it and let the county take it for unpaid taxes. But Lisa had kept paying those taxes from her modest teacher's pension, year after year, because it was her mother's legacy, and abandoning it felt like abandoning her mother's memory. She'd never imagined she'd actually need it as a place to live. But here she was, 2 years after her husband's passing, standing in the ruins because her own children had systematically taken everything else from her. When Michael passed, the house, their home of 40 years, had been in his name alone, an artifact of their 1983 marriage, when that was still common practice. In his will, he'd left it jointly to their children, Robert and Sarah, with a verbal understanding that Lisa would live there for the rest of her life. But verbal understandings, Lisa had learned, meant nothing when your children decided they had better uses for real estate assets. Robert, 45 and working in commercial real estate, had started the campaign 3 months after his father's passing. "Mom, this house is way too big for you alone. Don't you think it's dangerous? What if you fall? What if there's an emergency and no one's here?" Sarah, 42 and always following her older brother's lead, had joined in with concerned phone calls. "Mom, I worry about you rattling around in that big place by yourself. Wouldn't you be happier somewhere smaller? Somewhere with people around?" For months Lisa had resisted, insisting she was fine, that the house was her home, that she wasn't ready to leave the life she and Michael had built. But her children had been relentless, eroding her confidence with their constant worry, making her doubt her own capability. Finally, they'd convinced her to sign a power of attorney just in case. Something happened, and they needed to handle her affairs. It was supposed to be for emergencies only. They'd sold the house 6 weeks later. Lisa had come home from her weekly volunteer shift at the local food bank to find a sold sign in the yard, and her children in the living room with a real estate agent celebrating. "Surprise, Mom, we got an amazing offer, way over asking price. This is going to set you up so comfortably. We can get you into a really nice assisted living facility with the proceeds." When Lisa had protested, shocked and betrayed, Robert had been coldly practical. "Mom, you gave us power of attorney. Legally, we had the right to make this decision, and honestly, it's the smart move. You can't maintain a house this size alone. You're 70 years old. It's time to be realistic about your limitations. But this is my home, Lisa had said, voice breaking. Where am I supposed to go? We've researched some excellent facilities, Sarah had said, pulling out brochures. They have activities, meal plans, medical staff on site. You'll be so much safer. The argument had escalated. Robert had gotten frustrated. Mom, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. The house is sold. The new owners take possession in 60 days. You need to pick a facility or we'll have to pick one for you. What about the money from the house? Lisa had asked. That's your inheritance, Robert had said, his tone suggesting this should be obvious. Dad left the house to us. We sold it. The proceeds are ours. We'll help you with facility costs from our portion, of course, but the bulk of it is our inheritance. That's what Dad intended. Your father intended for me to live in that house for the rest of my life, Lisa had said, something hardening in her voice. He told me that explicitly before he passed. Well, he should have put it in the will then, Robert had snapped. But he didn't. So legally, this is how it is. Lisa had understood in that moment that she'd lost. Not just the house, but something more fundamental. The relationship she'd thought she had with her children, the family she'd sacrificed everything to build. They weren't worried about her safety or happiness. They wanted the money, and they'd found a legal way to take it, and they genuinely seemed to believe they were entitled to it. She'd refused the assisted living facility. If they were taking her home and her security, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of controlling where she lived. She told them she had somewhere to go, which was technically true, even if they had no idea where. Fine, Robert had said, clearly relieved not to have to deal with facility payments. If you've got it figured out, great. We'll have movers come pack your things and put them in storage. You can take whatever fits in your car. In the end, Lisa had taken one suitcase of clothes, a box of art supplies, her mother's Bible, and a photo album. Everything else, 40 years of accumulated life, furniture she and Michael had chosen together, artwork she'd created, books she'd collected, had been sold or donated by her children, who'd hired an estate service to handle everything efficiently. The cruelty of it had been almost incomprehensible. These were the babies she'd rocked through countless sleepless nights, the children she'd taught to read, the teenagers she'd supported through heartbreaks and struggles, the adults she'd helped financially whenever they needed it. And they'd taken everything from her without apparent remorse, because a legal technicality gave them the right. So here she was, 70 years old, standing in a roofless chapel on a cold March morning, with nowhere else to go. The property was hers. The one thing her children couldn't take because it had never been Michael's had come from her mother directly to her. The land was paid off. The property taxes were less than $200 a year, easily manageable on her pension. There was no electricity, no plumbing, no roof, no protection from the elements beyond stone walls. But it was hers, and that mattered more than anything else right now. Lisa set her suitcase down on the stone floor and looked around properly for the first time in years. The walls were still standing, massive stones fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist anymore. The floor was original slate, cracked in places but fundamentally sound. The space where the roof had been was open to the sky, which meant the interior was filled with natural light and, currently, weeds. Nature had aggressively reclaimed the space, vines growing through cracks, small trees sprouting from corners, grass pushing through floor stones, wildflowers blooming in what had once been the nave. It was beautiful in a wild, abandoned way, like looking at something that had been holy once and was now returning to the earth. Lisa walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing slightly off the stone. The chapel wasn't large, maybe 30 feet long and 20 feet wide with walls 12 feet high. Every surface was dirty, covered in decades of accumulated grime, bird droppings, fallen leaves, and moss. But underneath the neglect, the bones of the building were solid. Lisa found herself thinking about her art classes, lessons she'd taught hundreds of students over 30 years. She'd always told them that every painting started with a blank canvas, that you couldn't create something beautiful without first accepting the emptiness. She'd told them that mistakes weren't failures, but opportunities to create something unexpected. Standing in her roofless chapel filled with weeds, Lisa realized she'd been teaching herself all along. This wasn't a ruin, it was a blank canvas. That night, Lisa slept on the stone floor wrapped in a sleeping bag she'd bought with her last $100. It was cold, uncomfortable, and profoundly lonely. She cried herself to sleep for the first time since Michael had passed, finally allowing herself to fully feel the betrayal and loss and fear. But when she woke to sunlight streaming through the walls and a bird singing from the remains of what had been the altar, something in her had quietly shifted. She was 70 years old. She'd lost everything, and she was done living for other people's approval or needs. For the first time in 50 years, Lisa was going to create something purely for herself. Lisa spent the first 2 weeks just cleaning, working from dawn until her body forced her to stop from exhaustion. She'd bought basic camping supplies, a better sleeping bag, a camp stove, water jugs, a tarp to protect her sleeping area when it rained. She bathed using water heated on the camp stove, feeling 70 and vulnerable and surprisingly defiant. No one knew where she was. Her children had texted twice asking for her new address, for records, and she'd ignored both messages. For the first time in her adult life, no one was making demands on her time, energy, or resources. The solitude was frightening and liberating in equal measure. The physical work was harder than Lisa had anticipated. At 70, her body didn't respond the way it had even 10 years ago. Her back ached constantly. Her hands, which had arthritis anyway, became swollen and painful from hours of pulling weeds and scrubbing stone. She fell twice on wet stones, once badly enough that she lay on the floor for several minutes, wondering if she'd broken something and how she'd get help if she had. But she kept working, driven by something she didn't quite have words for yet, a need to prove something, maybe to herself, maybe to the universe, maybe to her ungrateful children who'd never know or care. She cleared the weeds methodically, pulling them up by the roots and making huge piles to burn. She swept years of accumulated leaves and debris, revealing the beautiful slate floor. She scrubbed the stone walls, bringing out colors and textures that had been hidden under grime. She cleaned the windows, removing moss and dirt until light poured through in beautiful patterns. Slowly, the chapel began to reveal itself, not as a ruin, but as a structure of remarkable beauty and craftsmanship. 3 weeks into her residency at the chapel, Lisa met Tom Mercer. She'd gone into Riverside to buy supplies at the hardware store, gardening tools, seeds, a small generator she was saving up for, and she'd been studying rakes when a voice behind her said, "The one with the fiberglass handle will last longer. Wood handles crack if you're working rough ground." Lisa had turned to find a man about her age, maybe slightly older, with weathered features and kind eyes, wearing work clothes that had clearly seen real work. "Thank you," she'd said. "I'm working on clearing a pretty overgrown area, so durability matters." "Anything interesting?" he'd asked with genuine curiosity, not just small talk. Lisa had hesitated. Then something about his straightforward manner made her answer honestly. "An old chapel. Been abandoned about 35 years. I'm trying to make it livable." His expression had shifted to interest. "St. Catherine's? The stone chapel out on rural Route 7? You know it? I'm a restoration craftsman. Retired now, but that was my work for 40 years. Specialized in historical buildings. I've driven past St. Catherine's probably 100 times. Always thought it was a shame to let it sit. That stonework is exceptional. 1880s construction, if I remember right." 1882, Lisa had confirmed. "It was my mother's property. It's mine now." "You're living there?" His tone was carefully neutral, but Lisa caught the unspoken question. "How are you living in a building without a roof?" "For now," she'd said, lifting her chin slightly, daring him to judge. "It needs work, but it's structurally sound, and it's mine. Nobody can take it." Something in her tone must have conveyed the story behind those words, because Tom's expression had softened with understanding rather than pity. "Tell you what, I'm retired and honestly pretty bored. Would you mind if I came by sometime to look at it? No charge, just professional interest. Maybe I could give you some ideas about what's possible." Lisa had been suspicious at first. Her trust in people's motives had been thoroughly shattered, but something about Tom seemed genuine. "I'm not looking for charity," she'd said carefully. "I don't have money to pay for professional work." "Not offering professional work," Tom had said. "Offering an old craftsman's opinion from someone who appreciates good stonework. If you don't want company, that's fine. But if you could use a second set of eyes on the project, I'm available." Lisa had given him directions. 2 days later, Tom had shown up in a pickup truck with his own tools, walked slowly around the chapel, examining everything with an expert's eye, and then surprised Lisa completely by saying, "This is remarkable. The stonework, the basic structure, it's all still perfect. Do you know how rare that is? Buildings from this era that have been neglected usually have significant structural damage, but whoever built this knew what they were doing. These walls will stand another 100 years easily." "But there's no roof," Lisa had pointed out. "No roof yet," Tom had corrected. But here's the interesting thing. Without a roof, this space has been open to the elements for 35 years, which means the stone has been weathering naturally. What if instead of trying to restore it as a chapel, you reimagined it as something new? A garden sanctuary, a cathedral under the open sky. Lisa had looked around, trying to see what he was seeing. That would take a lot of work, she'd said slowly. It would, Tom had agreed, but I've got time and you've got space. If you're interested, I could help. Not as a paid job. I'm retired and my pension covers my needs. But as a project, something worthwhile to work on. Why would you want to help me? Lisa had asked bluntly. You don't know me. Tom had been quiet for a moment before answering. My wife passed 4 years ago. We'd been married 46 years. Since then, I've been existing, going through motions. He'd gestured at the chapel. This is the first thing that's made me feel interested in anything in a long time. Sometimes people meet when they both need something to build. If you don't want help, I understand. But if you do, I'm offering. Lisa had studied him carefully, looking for hidden motives, manipulation, anything that suggested ulterior purposes. She'd been burned by trust recently, but Tom's expression had been open, sad in a way that suggested his grief was real and genuinely hopeful. Okay, she'd said finally, but I need you to understand something. I don't need rescuing. I don't need someone to fix my life. If we do this, we're partners. I work as hard as you do. I make decisions about what happens here. This is my space and I'm not giving up control of it to anyone ever again. Tom had smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Deal. Partners. Now, let's talk about what's actually possible here. Over the next 18 months, Lisa and Tom transformed the chapel from a weed-filled ruin into something neither of them had quite imagined at the start. They worked together 3 or 4 days a week, from morning until they were too tired to continue. Tom brought knowledge and skill. Lisa brought vision and determination. What emerged was a collaboration that felt, to both of them, like the first honest partnership either had experienced in years. The first thing they did was stabilize and enhance what was already there. Tom showed Lisa how to repair cracks in the stone walls using traditional lime mortar, how to address drainage issues so water wouldn't pool, how to reinforce the window openings. They worked section by section, cleaning and restoring stone that hadn't been properly maintained in decades. They decided against building a traditional roof. Instead, Tom designed and they built together a series of partial coverings, a small enclosed area at one end that would serve as storage and shelter during the worst weather, and several pergola-style coverings that provided shade and rain protection for specific areas while leaving most of the space open to the sky. Tom taught Lisa basic carpentry, and she found she had a good eye for measuring and fitting pieces together. For the first time in her life, Lisa was building something physical with her own hands, and the satisfaction was profound. But the real transformation was the garden. Lisa had always loved plants, but had never had time to seriously garden. Between teaching, raising children, and caring for her husband through his illness, there'd never been space in her life for something purely for beauty and peace. Now, with nothing but time and a blank canvas of stone and soil, Lisa threw herself into creating something extraordinary. She started with the floor, removing enough slate in strategic places to create planting beds while keeping pathways clear. She brought in good soil, compost, everything needed to support plants in what had been barren stone. She visited every plant nursery within driving distance, spending her modest pension on seeds, seedlings, and mature plants. She chose everything with an artist's eye, flowering vines to climb the stone walls, creating cascades of color against gray stone, shade-loving plants for areas covered by the pergolas, sun-loving flowers for the open spaces, herbs that would scent the air. She created a raised bed in the old altar area and filled it with roses, peace roses, which seemed appropriate. Tom built raised planters along the walls, deep enough for small trees. They planted dogwoods, redbuds, trees that would grow but not so large they'd threaten the walls. But Lisa's true masterpiece was what she painted on the walls. As the garden began to establish itself, she started using the stone walls as canvases, painting directly on the interior surfaces with weather-resistant paints. She painted murals that blended with and enhanced the garden, vines that seemed to grow from painted roots into real vines, birds that appeared to fly from painted sky into real sky, flowers that transitioned from painted to living. She painted the faces of people she'd known, people who'd been marginalized or overlooked, elderly people from the nursing home where she'd volunteered, individuals she'd met at the food bank who struggled with poverty and hardship, students who'd faced challenges. She painted them as saints in the traditional chapel style, but saints with weathered faces and real-life burdens, saints who looked like people who'd actually suffered and survived. The work was extraordinarily beautiful and deeply moving, a statement about who deserved to be memorialized, who deserved to be seen as holy. Tom watched her work with obvious admiration. "So you're really talented," he'd said one afternoon as she painted an elderly woman's face, capturing both the weight of years and the light of enduring dignity. "Why did you stop being an artist?" "I didn't stop being an artist," Lisa had said quietly. "I just became the kind of artist who helped other people make art instead of making my own. I told myself it was noble, teaching instead of creating. But the truth is I was scared. Scared that my own work wouldn't be good enough. Scared that wanting things for myself made me selfish." She'd paused, brush poised. "My whole life I was scared of being selfish, and look where it got me." "It got you here," Tom had said, "creating this." He gestured at the garden taking shape, the paintings transforming stone walls into art. "Maybe that's not where you planned to be, but it's pretty remarkable." Lisa had looked around at what they'd built together, this strange, beautiful space that was part garden, part art installation, part spiritual sanctuary. "You know what's funny? My children took everything from me. They took my home, my security, my sense of being a good mother. They took it all, and somehow that freed me to create this. If they hadn't betrayed me, I'd still be living in that house, watching TV, being a convenient grandmother, putting everyone else first. I'd never have known I could do this." "Silver linings can be sharp enough to cut," Tom had observed, "but they're still real." As the seasons changed and the garden matured, something else was growing, a quiet relationship between Lisa and Tom that neither of them had expected or particularly pursued, but that felt natural and right. They weren't romantic partners. At 70 and 72, neither was particularly interested in romance. But they were true partners, friends, people who'd found each other at a point in their lives when they both needed someone to build something with. They shared lunch most days they worked, sitting on the stone benches Tom had built, eating sandwiches and talking about their lives. Lisa learned about Tom's late wife Ruth, the slow grief of watching her face a long illness, the emptiness afterward. Tom learned about Michael's illness, the years of caregiving, the complicated feelings of loss mixed with relief when someone you love finally stops suffering. They talked about their children. Tom's son had moved across the country and called maybe once a month. His daughter was busy with her own family and meant well, but rarely made time to actually visit. "They don't need me anymore," Tom had said, "and I guess that's natural, but it's lonely anyway." "They shouldn't have needed me the way they did," Lisa had said. "I made myself too necessary. I made them dependent instead of capable, and then when I couldn't give anymore, they didn't know how to care back. That's partly my fault." "No," Tom had said firmly. "You were a devoted mother. What they did, taking your home, abandoning you, that's their failing, not yours. Don't take responsibility for their cruelty." They'd sat in silence for a while, and then Lisa had said something she'd been thinking for weeks. "I don't know if I can forgive them. Everyone talks about forgiveness like it's something you owe people, but I don't think I want to forgive what they did. Does that make me a bad person?" Tom had thought about it seriously before answering. "I think forgiveness is something you do for yourself when you're ready, not something you owe anyone else. And I think it's okay to protect yourself from people who've hurt you, even if they're family, especially if they're family." The chapel continued to evolve. By late fall, with most of the major work completed, it had become something truly remarkable. Word had started spreading locally. People who'd driven past the property for years noticed the transformation, and a few had stopped to ask if they could look inside. Lisa had hesitated at first, protective of her space, but Tom had encouraged her to share it. "Art shouldn't exist only for the artist," he'd said. "It exists to be seen." So Lisa had started allowing visitors, and the response had been overwhelming. People stood in the chapel and cried. They sat on the benches and stayed for hours. They came back repeatedly, bringing friends and family. The local paper ran a feature, "From Ruin to Sanctuary, Local Artist Creates Garden Cathedral." The article had included photos of the painted walls, the cascading flowers, the play of light through the open roof. It had mentioned, briefly, that the artist was living on site in challenging conditions, and had noted that she'd created the space after losing her home. The article had not mentioned her children. Robert and Sarah called within hours of the article's publication. Lisa was painting when her phone rang, adding detail to one of the faces on the wall, a woman she'd known from the food bank who'd struggled with poverty. She'd been ignoring her phone for months, letting it go to voicemail, so when she absently answered without checking the caller ID, she was genuinely startled to hear Sarah's voice. "Mom, oh my God, Mom, we've been so worried about you. You haven't been answering our calls or texts. We didn't know where you were." Lisa's hand had tightened on her brush. "Sarah, Mom, we saw the article about the chapel. We had no idea that's where you'd gone. Why didn't you tell us? We would have helped." The sheer audacity of the statement, the rewriting of recent history, took Lisa's breath away for a moment. "Would you have?" she'd asked quietly. "You're living in a building without a roof, Mom. That's not safe at your age. I did tell you I didn't want to go to assisted living. You told me to figure it out myself." There was a brief pause. "Well, we didn't think you'd end up living in a ruin. Mum, this article says you've been doing extensive work on the property. That chapel must be worth quite a bit now, with all these improvements. Have you thought about what you want to do with it?" And there it was, the real reason for the call. "What do you mean, what I want to do with it?" "Well, I mean, you can't live there long term. But if you sold it now with all this publicity, you could probably get a really good price. And of course, we'd want to help you invest any remaining funds properly." Lisa had actually laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You want me to sell it, so you can get your hands on whatever money is left, just like you did with the house. That's not fair, Mom. We're trying to help you plan for your future." "No, you're trying to profit from my work. Again. Let me be very clear, Sarah. This property is mine. I will never sell it. And when I pass, I'm leaving it to a conservation trust, not to you or your brother. So whatever you and Robert are planning, stop." "Mom, why are you being so hostile? We're your family." "You were my family," Lisa had said, and heard her own voice go cold and distant. "You stopped being my family when you stole my home and abandoned me to figure out my survival alone. Family doesn't do what you did. You're genetic relatives, that's all. Mum, don't call me again unless you have something genuine to apologize for. Not a pretend apology that's really about wanting something. A real accounting of what you did and why it was wrong. Until then, don't contact me." She'd hung up before Sarah could respond and immediately blocked both her children's numbers. Her hands were shaking, and she realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the sheer release of finally saying what she'd been unable to say when they'd taken her home. Tom had arrived an hour later for their usual workday, and had found her sitting on one of the stone benches, still upset. She'd told him about the phone call, and he'd listened without interrupting. When she finished, he'd said simply, "Good for you. You set a boundary. That's hard, but you did it." Over the next several months, the story of the chapel continued to spread. A regional art magazine did a feature. The town council designated the property as a local historic landmark, which came with a small annual preservation grant that Lisa used to fund ongoing maintenance. Most meaningfully to Lisa, the chapel had become a gathering place. People asked if they could hold events there, a wedding between two elderly widowers who wanted to get married under the open sky. A memorial service for a veteran whose family held it in the chapel, specifically because he was painted on the walls. Small meditation groups that met in the mornings. Art classes that Lisa began teaching to anyone who wanted to learn, free of charge, because teaching art in this space felt completely different from teaching in a classroom. It felt like sharing something sacred instead of checking off curriculum requirements. Tom had built Lisa a small proper dwelling in one corner of the property, a tiny house really, with electricity from solar panels, a composting toilet, a small kitchen, and a sleeping loft. It was warm, dry, and infinitely more comfortable than her original camping setup. Tom had his own house in town, but he spent most days at the chapel now, continuing to improve and maintain it. They'd developed a routine, a partnership that felt like family in ways her actual family never had, based on mutual respect, shared work, and genuine care for each other's well-being. 2 years after Lisa had first arrived at the roofless chapel with a single suitcase and nowhere else to go, St. Catherine's Garden Sanctuary, as it had come to be known, had evolved into something beyond what Lisa had imagined that first desperate morning. The space held gardens in full bloom, stone walls covered in beautiful murals, and most days people sitting quietly on the benches Tom had built, seeking peace or inspiration or just a beautiful place to sit. On a September afternoon, Lisa was teaching a watercolor class to a group of 6 elderly students when she saw a car pull up at the property entrance. She recognized it instantly. Sarah's car, But Sarah wasn't alone. A teenage girl got out with her, Lisa's granddaughter Emma, who she hadn't seen in over 2 years. Lisa felt her chest tighten, old hurt rising automatically, but she finished the demonstration she was giving to her students, complimented their work, and then excused herself to see what her daughter wanted. Sarah and Emma approached slowly, both looking nervous. Sarah spoke first. "Hi, Mum. I know we weren't invited, but I needed to come talk to you, and Emma asked to come." Lisa looked at her granddaughter, now 15 and so much older than the last time she'd seen her. "Emma." "Grandma," Emma said, and her voice broke slightly. "I didn't know. I just found out what happened. Dad and Mom told us you moved because you wanted to be alone, that you chose not to see us. They didn't tell us they took your house. I'm so sorry." Lisa felt something crack inside her. "They told you I chose to leave. They said you were going through something after Grandpa passed and needed space," Emma said. "But I found the old article about the chapel, and I read what really happened. I confronted Mom about it. That's why we're here." Lisa looked at Sarah, who looked genuinely uncomfortable. "Is that true?" "I didn't lie exactly," Sarah said defensively. I didn't tell them everything." "You lied by omission," Lisa said flatly. "You let them think I abandoned them when you're the ones who abandoned me." "I know," Sarah said, and to Lisa's surprise, her daughter's voice sounded genuinely ashamed. "I know what we did was wrong. I've known for a while, actually. But I didn't want to admit it. And then Emma found out and she was so angry with me, and I realized we'd become the kind of people our kids are ashamed of." Emma was crying now. "Grandma, can I see what you built? Can you show me?" Lisa hesitated, protective of her space, unwilling to let people who'd hurt her into the sanctuary she'd created. But this was Emma, who she'd loved since birth, who'd been lied to, who hadn't been part of the betrayal. "Yes," Lisa said quietly. "You can see it." She led them into the chapel and watched Emma's face transform as she took in the garden cathedral, the cascading flowers, the painted walls, the light pouring through the open roof, the beauty that had grown from abandonment. "This is incredible," Emma whispered. "You made all of this?" "Tom and I made it together," Lisa said. "It took 2 years." "The faces on the walls," Emma said, moving closer to examine the painted saints with their weathered, real faces. "Who are they?" "People who deserved to be remembered," Lisa said. "People society overlooked. People who were treated as disposable, but who had dignity and worth." Emma stood in front of one of the paintings for a long time, then turned back to Lisa. "Will you teach me to paint like this?" The question surprised Lisa. "You want to learn?" "I want to learn everything," Emma said. "I want to know how you did this. I want to understand." Lisa looked at her granddaughter's earnest face and felt something shift. Not forgiveness for her children, but possibility. A door that might open. "I teach classes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday mornings," Lisa said. "If your mother will bring you, you're welcome to come." Sarah, who'd been standing quietly watching, spoke up. "I'll bring her. And Mom, I know I don't deserve it, but could I come too? To the classes?" "Why?" Lisa asked bluntly. "Why now?" "Because I need to understand what I helped destroy," Sarah said, and her voice was shaking. "I need to see what you built after we—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "After you took everything from me," Lisa finished for her. "Yes." There was a long silence. Finally, Lisa said, "Here's what I can offer. You can come to the classes, both of you. But being here doesn't mean we're reconciled. It doesn't mean I trust you or that we're going back to how things were. It means you're students in a class I'm teaching. If you want more than that, you'll have to earn it, and I don't know if that's possible." "I understand," Sarah said. Can I ask one thing?" "What?" "Robert won't come. He's still angry about the publicity, still thinks we didn't do anything wrong. If I do this, if I try to earn forgiveness without him, will you hold his behavior against me?" Lisa considered the question carefully. "Your brother made his own choices. You made yours. You're responsible for your own actions, not his. If you genuinely want to try to repair this, I'll judge you on your own efforts, not his." Sarah nodded, tears running down her face now. "I'm sorry, Mum. I know that's not enough. I know saying it doesn't fix anything. But I'm sorry for what we did. It was cruel and selfish and wrong. I'm sorry. It wasn't enough. Words could never be enough. But it was a start." "Okay," Lisa said. "Classes start at 9 on Tuesday. Don't be late." Over the following months, Sarah and Emma came to every class. Emma threw herself into learning art with genuine passion, showing real talent. Sarah was less skilled, but worked diligently, and more importantly, showed up week after week, putting in time and effort without demanding immediate reconciliation. She helped with garden work when asked. She brought supplies when needed. She didn't push for more than Lisa was willing to give. Slowly, carefully, something began to rebuild. Not the old relationship. That was gone, broken beyond repair, but something new and more honest. Sarah started being real about her life in ways she never had before, admitting her marriage was struggling, that she felt trapped in a life of expensive appearances, that she'd made choices based on money and social status that had cost her things that actually mattered. "I thought having money would make me happy," she admitted one morning while they were working side by side planting spring bulbs. "I thought that's what mattered, but I was miserable even when we got the money from your house, and I couldn't admit that we'd hurt you for something that didn't even make us happy." "Money can solve problems," Lisa said, "but it can't create meaning. I learned that the hard way too. I spent 50 years thinking sacrifice and service would make me valuable. They didn't. They made me useful, which people will exploit if you let them." "How do you stop being angry?" Sarah asked. "At us, at what happened?" "I don't know if I have stopped," Lisa admitted. "I'm less angry than I was, but mostly I've just built something that matters more than the anger. This place, this work, the people I teach, that's where I put my energy now. The anger just doesn't have as much room anymore." 3 years after Lisa had arrived at the ruined chapel with nothing but a suitcase and nowhere else to go, St. Catherine's Garden Sanctuary celebrated its 3rd annual open house. The event had grown from 200 visitors the first year to over 1,000 people who came to see what had become a regional landmark. Lisa, now 73, stood with Tom, now 75, watching people move through the sanctuary they'd created together. Emma, now 18 and preparing to start art school in the spring, was leading tours and explaining the sanctuary's history to visitors with practiced ease. Sarah helped coordinate volunteers and had, somewhat surprisingly, become one of Lisa's most reliable assistants in maintaining the garden and teaching classes. She would never be close with Lisa the way they'd been before the betrayal. That relationship was gone forever. But they'd built something new, a relationship based on honesty rather than expectation, on mutual work rather than assumed obligation. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Robert had never come, never apologized, had written Lisa off entirely as crazy and vindictive. Lisa had long since stopped expecting anything from him. Some people never grew into their better selves. That was their choice, and their loss. A reporter from a national magazine approached Lisa in the afternoon. They were doing a feature on second act creativity and wanted to interview her. The reporter asked the questions Lisa had been asked 100 times, about losing her home, about building the sanctuary, about her relationship with her children. But then she asked something new. What would you say to people who are facing loss in their 70s or 80s? People who feel like their lives are over? Lisa thought about it seriously before answering. "I'd say that loss breaks you open, but what grows in the broken places can be more beautiful than what was there before. I'd say that being discarded by people who should have valued you hurts terribly, but it also frees you from living for their approval. I'd say that starting over at 70 is terrifying and hard, and you'll doubt yourself constantly, but you're more capable than you think." She paused, looking around at the sanctuary. "And I'd say that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you cracks you open in exactly the way you needed, even though you never would have chosen it. I didn't want to lose my home. I didn't want to be betrayed by my children. I didn't want to end up living in a roofless chapel with nothing. But if I hadn't lost everything else, I never would have found this. I never would have created this. I never would have become this version of myself." The reporter smiled. "So, you're glad it happened?" "No," Lisa said honestly. "I'm not glad it happened. It was cruel, and it hurt, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. But I'm glad about what I built from it. There's a difference." As the afternoon wore on and the crowd began to thin, Lisa found herself standing alone in the center of the sanctuary, looking up at the sky, visible through the space where a roof had once been and would never be again. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, broken, betrayed, sleeping on stone floors, wondering if she'd survive. She thought about how that woman had slowly, painfully, built something extraordinary from nothing but stones and dirt and rage and eventual grace. She thought about her children, Sarah, who'd finally found the courage to acknowledge harm and try to make amends, Robert, who'd chosen money and pride over relationship, Emma, who'd been lied to but had sought truth anyway. She thought about Tom, who'd shown up when she needed someone and had stayed because they'd built something together that mattered to both of them. She thought about her students, some of them elderly people who'd come to her classes after experiencing their own losses and betrayals, who found healing in making art in this sacred space. She thought about the thousands of visitors who'd stood in this place and felt peace, found hope, remembered that beauty could grow from ruins. She thought about forgiveness, real forgiveness, not the kind people demanded, but the kind you discovered in your own time. She'd forgiven Sarah mostly, not by forgetting or pretending the betrayal hadn't happened, but by releasing the expectation that Sarah could ever give back what she'd taken. Some things once broken couldn't be restored to their original state, but they could be transformed into something new. She'd forgiven herself, finally, for being the kind of mother who'd made her children dependent instead of capable, for spending 50 years living for everyone else, for not becoming herself until she was 70 and had lost everything. She'd even, in a strange way, forgiven Robert, though he'd never apologize and she'd never see him again. Not because he deserved forgiveness, but because carrying anger at someone who would never change was like carrying stones. She'd rather build with stones than carry them. The sanctuary had taught her that. Tom approached, carrying 2 cups of tea from the refreshment table. "Penny for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about how strange life is," Lisa said, accepting the tea gratefully. 3 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, but actually, I'd just lost everything that was in the way. In the way of what? Of this. Of becoming this. Of being someone who creates instead of just facilitates. Of building something that's mine that I made that no one can take. She looked around at the sanctuary, the stone walls that had stood for over a century and would stand for another century, the garden that would bloom again every spring, the painted faces of forgotten people now memorialized as saints, the space that had become holy, not through religious ritual, but through transformation and work, and refusing to let loss be the final word. "You know what the best part is?" Lisa asked. "What?" "I don't need anyone's permission anymore. Not my children's approval, not society's validation, not anyone's agreement that what I'm doing matters. I know it matters because I made it. That's enough." Tom clinked his teacup against hers. To being enough, Lisa agreed. As the sun set and the last visitors departed, Lisa and Tom walked slowly around the sanctuary one final time before locking up for the night. The garden glowed in the dusk, flowers luminous in the fading light, stone walls solid and eternal, sky visible overhead where a roof had once been and would never be again. Lisa had built peace from stone. She'd created beauty from betrayal. She'd transformed loss into legacy, and she'd done it at 70 when the world thought her life was over, when her own children had discarded her as no longer valuable. She'd proved that dreams don't age, that creativity has no expiration date, that it's never too late to become yourself. The chapel stood, Lisa stood, and that was everything. If you've ever been discarded by those who should have cherished you, if you've ever lost everything and had to rebuild from stone and will, if you've ever wondered if it's too late to become who you were meant to be, Lisa's story is for you. Share this with someone who needs to remember that loss can be the beginning rather than the end, that 70 is young enough to start over, and that the most beautiful gardens sometimes grow in the places where everything else was stripped away. This is the community that proves transformation has no age limit, that peace is built stone by stone, and that your worth isn't determined by who values you, but by what you create. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. End.